The security guard was pretending not to watch me. I noticed him the way I notice most things peripherally, without making it obvious that I had noticed. Filing it in the part of my mind that catalogs useful information and retrieves it when needed. He was standing near the pillar across the lobby, arms at his sides, eyes moving between me and the main entrance in a rotation that had nothing to do with actual security protocol and everything to do with the specific discomfort of a young man who has been told to monitor someone and is trying not to look like he's monitoring them. I did not acknowledge him. I was busy. My phone was open to my email. I had been composing this particular message for 7 minutes, which is longer than I usually take. I have drafted quickly my entire professional life, because in the work I did for 26 years, the clarity of your documentation was often the difference between a case that held and a case that fell apart on a technicality. But this message required a different kind of precision. Not the precision of urgency, the precision of restraint. Every word I put in it would become part of a record, and records, once made, are permanent. Subject: Meridian Group beginning referral documentation. Event 11/14. I read it over one more time. I pressed send. Then I set the phone in my lap. I looked at the lobby around me, the Grand Peachtree Hotel, Atlanta, Georgia, on a Thursday evening in November. High ceilings with the particular acoustics of expensive rooms, the sound of the city filtered through glass and marble. Behind the ballroom's closed double doors, 40 feet from where I was sitting, I could hear music. A live band, good one. The particular warmth of a room where 300 people are eating food they did not cook and congratulating each other on their generosity. I had been in that room. I had been asked to leave. Not in those exact words, nobody says it in those exact words when they want to keep the appearance of civilization, but the result was the same. And now I was in this chair, in this lobby, with my heels resting on the marble floor beside me, because I had been sitting here long enough that comfort became more important than presentation, and I was composing documentation. I want to stop here and ask you something. Have you ever been dismissed so completely, so publicly, so casually, so deliberately that the person doing it didn't even bother to pretend it was about anything other than what it was? And have you ever, in that moment, had the experience of understanding that your response to that dismissal is going to matter more than the dismissal itself? Leave a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from tonight. And stay with me, because what I did in that lobby chair is the beginning of something I have been meaning to tell for a while now. Let me go back, 90 minutes earlier. I arrived at the Grand Peachtree at 7:45. Which is 15 minutes before I had been told to arrive, because I am, and have always been, a woman who arrives before the scheduled time, so she knows the room before the room knows her. I gave my name at the registration desk. I received my lanyard. I found my table assignment on the seating chart, table 9, near the center of the room, which told me I was placed where consultants and professional service providers sit, close enough to the action to appear included. Far enough from the center tables to be clearly outside the principal tier. I found my table. I was the only person seated. I arranged my place, setting the way I prefer it. Water glass, moved to the left, bread plate adjusted, and I sat and watched the room fill. Meridian Group's annual charity gala is the kind of event where Atlanta's business community comes to be seen doing good things with money they have in quantities that make doing good things with it uncomplicated. The grand ballroom had been dressed for it. Tall floral arrangements on every table, crystal that caught the light from a chandelier that must have been imported from somewhere with a longer tradition of this kind of excess, a parquet dance floor that nobody would use until after 10. Along the perimeter, silent auction items. Along the back, a champagne tower that was decorative rather than functional but accomplished its purpose, which was to make the room feel abundant. I am 61 years old. I have been in rooms like this for 30 years. They do not impress me, and they do not intimidate me, and I am not particularly moved by what they represent. What I was in that room for was work specifically, the completion of a financial compliance review I had been contracted to conduct for Meridian Group's newly established charitable foundation. I had been working on that review for 6 weeks. I had reviewed 340 pages of documentation. I had asked 18 questions in writing and received 12 answers. I was there that evening to observe the foundation's public launch and to request a meeting with the CFO the following week to address the 6 unanswered questions. That was the work. The work was straightforward. What was not straightforward was the moment Garrett Holloway shook my hand. He is the CEO of Meridian Group, mid-50s, silver gray at the temples. The kind of physical presence that comes from spending your entire adult life in rooms where physical presence is currency. He moves the way men move when they have never had to negotiate for space. He arrived at my table around 8:15, working the room in the methodical way of a host who has guest rotation down to muscle memory. He shook hands with the 2 lawyers to my left and the foundation board member to my right. When he reached me, he shook my hand, with his eyes already moving toward the next handshake, said something that was not quite my name and not quite a greeting, and moved on before I had finished my sentence. I noted it. I did not react to it. I have been in rooms where I am invisible for 30 years, and I understand that visibility is a choice mine, not theirs, and that choosing when to become visible is a skill I have had a long time to practice. The event proceeded. The foundation was announced. Garrett gave a toast that was warm and polished, and had clearly been prepared with help from someone who understood that toasts at charity galas perform a specific function and should not deviate from that function. He thanked his team. He thanked the guests. He thanked the tireless support staff. His eyes moved across the table when he said it, and paused, briefly, on me. I held his gaze for exactly 1 second. Then I looked down at my water glass. I was thinking about the 6 unanswered compliance questions and whether any of them were connected to each other in a way I had not yet fully mapped. At 8:40, I approached him during the cocktail portion to ask a compliance question that had been on my agenda for 2 weeks. Specifically, a question about the structural relationship between Meridian's holding entities and the Foundation's charitable disbursement accounts. He was mid-conversation with a man I recognized from the Georgia Chamber of Commerce. I waited the appropriate amount of time. I said his name when there was a natural pause. He looked at me the way he had looked at the Champagne Tower, as an object in the room, present and decorative and not requiring engagement. I said, "Mr. Holloway, I have a follow-up question from the compliance review about the holding entity structure. It will take about 3 minutes." He said to the man beside him, "Could you hold on 1 second?" Then he looked at me and said, "Can you coordinate with my assistant? She's at the registration table." And he turned back to the conversation. I had already spoken to his assistant 3 times. She had not replied to my last 2 messages. I went back to my table. I poured my own water. I thought about what 26 years in federal financial crimes investigation has taught me about the difference between an organization that has compliance issues and an organization that has something to hide. The difference is in how they respond to questions. Organizations with compliance issues are embarrassed. Organizations with something to hide are dismissive. Meridian Group had stopped being embarrassed after the first 2 weeks. At 9:15, Garrett Holloway approached my table with a second man I did not know him. Would later learn he was Meridian's head of operations, and said, to the space, slightly to my left, "Could someone help this guest find the service entrance? I think she's gotten a little turned around." The second man put his hand near my elbow, not on it, in the way of someone whose job requires physical redirection without physical contact. I stood before he had to make contact. I picked up my clutch. I looked at Garrett Holloway directly. He was already looking elsewhere. I walked out of the ballroom. The security guard followed at a professional distance. In the lobby, he indicated the chair near the pillar and asked, in the careful language of someone doing something he has been told to do and does not entirely feel good about, if I would like to wait here while they sorted things out. I said, "Thank you. Yes." I sat. I took out my phone. He went to stand near the pillar. I opened my email. I began to write. This is what I want you to understand about what I was doing in that lobby chair. I was not sitting there because I was defeated. I was not sitting there because I was waiting for someone to come and correct what had happened. I was sitting there because the lobby of the Grand Peachtree Hotel on a Thursday evening in November is a perfectly adequate location to begin formal documentation, and formal documentation was what the moment required. 7 minutes. Subject line written. Send. I put my phone in my clutch. I put my heels back on. I stood. I thanked the security guard, who looked surprised to be thanked. I walked to the valet stand and gave my ticket. While I waited, my phone rang. The name on the screen was Simone. I answered. She said, "Mama ready. I heard what happened at the Meridian Gala. Are you okay? I'm so sorry." Her voice was warm, with the specific warmth of concern. The warmth I had heard from her since she was 14 years old. Calling from her bedroom to ask if I needed anything. The warmth that I had, until recently, understood to be genuine. I said, "I'm fine, baby. I'll call you this weekend." My car arrived. I tipped the valet. I got in. I drove home on 285, the Atlanta skyline, to my left, doing what it does at night, pretending to be something other than a business corridor with good lighting. I thought about Simone's voice. I thought about the spreadsheet on my home computer that I had been building for 11 days, now showing 14 flagged transactions across 19 months. Each one carrying an authorization signature that had my name on it and was not my signature. I thought about the fact that Simone worked in wealth management. I thought about the name of her employer, which I had been seeing in my mind's eye all evening with the particular clarity of something that has lodged itself in a place that requires attention. Pinnacle Wealth Management. I thought about the Meridian compliance documents on my desk at home. Specifically the subsidiary structure appendix, page 31. Specifically the footnote at the bottom of that page. I had read it 6 weeks ago and had not yet gone back to it because I had not yet had reason to. I had reason now. I parked in my driveway. I unlocked the front door. I went directly to my desk. I opened the Meridian subsidiary appendix to page 31. I found the footnote. I read the 3 words that had been waiting there for 6 weeks, in 8-point type, in the specific gray that legal documents use for footnotes because they are considered secondary information. Pinnacle Wealth Management. Below it, registered LLC, wholly owned subsidiary of Meridian Group Holdings. I sat back in my chair. The room was quiet. Outside, somewhere down the block, a dog was barking at something it had decided was worth the attention. I looked at the words on the page. I looked at the spreadsheet on my screen. 14 flagged transactions, 19 months, my name on every one. I thought about Garrett Holloway in a ballroom with 300 people and the specific ease of a man who has never had reason to believe he can be caught. I opened a new document. At the top, I wrote 2 words, case file. Then I began. There is a specific kind of silence that happens at 5:45 in the morning when you have been awake for an hour already and the rest of the neighborhood has not yet decided to be. I know that silence well. I worked in it for most of my career. The early hours when the documentation is in front of you and the phone has not yet started ringing, and the only thing between you and understanding is the quality of your own attention. Some agents hate the early morning. I have always found it the most honest part of the day. Nothing performing itself yet, just what is. The legal pad from the night before was on the desk to my left. I had filled 4 pages before I went to bed at 115 circles and lines and asterisks in the system I developed my 3rd year in the field and have never changed because it works. On the right side of the desk, the Meridian compliance documents, tabbed and annotated. On the screen in front of me, James's estate account, 19 months of statements. The spreadsheet I had been building for 11 days now, open to the tab labeled flagged. 14 transactions, 14 authorization signatures bearing my name that I did not write. Coffee was on the counter behind me. I had made it. I had not touched it. I have let coffee go cold more times in my life than I can count, and I have never successfully changed this about myself, and I stopped trying. I picked up the pen. I opened the legal pad to a clean page. At the top, I drew 2 circles. I labeled one Meridian. I labeled the other Estate JC. Then I drew a line between them and wrote one word where the line met itself: Pinnacle. 2 cases, 1 thread. This is always how it starts. 26 years in IRS criminal investigation taught me that the people who build financial fraud schemes believe in the power of separation. Separate accounts, separate entities, separate names on separate documents. The assumption underneath all of it is that no single investigator will ever be looking at every piece at the same time, that the left hand will never know what the right hand is doing because no one person's field of vision is wide enough to hold both. What they do not account for is the investigator who has personal standing in both fields, the one they dismiss before understanding what she knows. I knew what I knew. I let them dismiss me anyway. And then I came home and opened the document. Let me tell you what 26 years actually looks like. Because I have found that people have a version of it in their minds that is borrowed from television, and the television version is wrong in almost every detail. The work is not dramatic. The work is reading. It is the patient, methodical movement through documents that were designed to be unreadable, finding the places where the numbers do not add up, and then finding out why. It is the footnote on page 47 that contradicts the summary on page 3. It is the administrative fee that appears on 9 separate accounts in the same month with the same rounded amount, which is not how legitimate administrative fees work. It is understanding that arrogance leaves fingerprints that the people who believe they are too powerful to be caught are also the people who stop being careful because careful requires the kind of sustained attention that arrogance corrodes. The Houston case. I found the initial discrepancy in a transportation logistics audit that a junior agent had flagged and then set aside as probably a software error. I read the flagged line at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday in October, and I knew, with the certainty that comes from a decade of reading documents, that it was not a software error. It took me 4 months to build what that line was connected to. 11 years was the sentence. The executive called his attorney from the courtroom with the particular shock of a man who genuinely believed, until the gavel came down, that his network would protect him. The New Orleans case. An estate attorney who had been stealing from elderly black clients for 11 years. His method was patience small, regular withdrawals from accounts managed by widows who were isolated by grief, overwhelmed by paperwork, and entirely unaware that the administrative fees they were paying had no legitimate basis. The pattern I found was not in any individual account. It was in the aggregate. Widows over 65, estates under $2 million, accounting firms in the same 2-county radius. I identified 12 victims before I had enough to file. There were 23. In the end, the attorney wore a very good suit to his arraignment. He did not wear it to his sentencing. I have been doing this work long enough to know that predators have signatures. Not literally, not the way forgers do, though that too. I mean a structural signature, the particular shape of how they choose their targets and protect themselves from accountability. They choose people they believe will not be believed. They choose people whose access to resources, legal, financial, social, is limited enough that fighting back is not a realistic option. They choose people who are already carrying something heavy enough that one more thing might be what finally makes them set everything down. James would have said, they choose people they think don't have backup. He had a way of simplifying things that I spent a career complicating. He was usually right. James Chambers was a school principal for 33 years in the Atlanta public school system. He ran 3 different schools over that time, started at a middle school in Bankhead that nobody wanted to take on, left it 4 years later with its first accreditation renewal in a decade, moved on to 2 more, and did the same each time. He remembered the name of every student he had ever had, not as a performance. It was simply how his mind worked. He had categorized them by year and by face, and by the particular challenges they had been carrying, and he could retrieve any of them without effort and without drama, the way I can retrieve a case number from 2009 if someone gives me a partial detail, different kind of memory. Same underlying architecture. He left behind a house that was almost paid off, a modest retirement account. And the thing he was most deliberate about, a college fund for our grandson Eli that he had been building for 11 years, contribution by contribution, with the specific conviction of a man who had watched too many students arrive at the threshold of something better and not have the means to cross it. Education is the one thing nobody can take back, he said, more than once, in the way people repeat the things they most believe. He made me promise to protect that fund. I told him it did not need protecting. It was in a secured estate account. There were controls. I had been wrong about the controls. I went back 30 months in the estate records, 1 month at a time, every statement, every transaction, 16 unauthorized withdrawals, ranging from $2,800 to $6,400, spaced at irregular intervals not so frequent as to establish a detectable pattern, not so rare as to be missed in any single quarterly review, which is exactly the spacing of someone who understands how account monitoring works. Total across 30 months, $74,000. The signatures were good. I need to say that plainly because it is accurate, and accuracy matters to me even when what I am describing makes me look foolish. They were not amateur copies. They had been practiced. The loop of the L, the particular pressure I put on the T, the way the last stroke of my last name curves slightly upward, whoever studied my signature, had access to multiple examples across multiple contexts, and had spent meaningful time learning its characteristics. Sloppy forgery is easy to catch. Practiced forgery requires someone with patience, with time, and with regular access to documents I had signed in their presence. Simone had been in my house hundreds of times. She had sat beside me at that desk while we went through James's estate paperwork in the months after he died. She had handed me documents to sign and watched me do it. She knew where I kept the estate files. She had a key to the house. I had given it to her myself 8 years ago, for exactly the reasons you give someone you trust a key, so she could come and go, so she could water the plants when I traveled, so she would never be locked out of a place that had always been hers to be in. I sat with that for a moment, on the morning after the gala, sat with what it means when the access you gave out of love becomes the instrument of the damage. Then I moved on, because the work does not wait for me to finish grieving, and I have never let it. The Meridian document trail was a different kind of reading, not the linear reading of financial statements, but the architectural reading of corporate structures, which requires a different kind of patience. You are not following a number. You are following an intention. You are asking, why is this entity here? What does it accomplish that could not be accomplished more simply? What would disappear if it weren't? The answers to those questions, if you ask them systematically and document every answer, build a picture that is more complete than the picture any single document contains. I mapped it by hand. On the legal pad, circles and lines, the way I have always done it. Meridian Group Holdings at the top. Below it, 11 subsidiary entities, each with its own registered address and its own stated purpose. 3 of them in Delaware, 1 in Nevada, the rest in Georgia, scattered across addresses that a skip trace would quickly identify as registered agent offices rather than actual places of business. The kind of addresses that exist to provide legal presence without physical substance, which is not inherently fraudulent, but is consistently present in structures designed to obscure rather than organize. Pinnacle Wealth Management was 3 entities removed from Meridian Group Holdings. far enough to appear independent in any single entity review. Not far enough to escape a forensic accounting trace from someone who knew what she was looking for and had the patience to map every step between them. I finished the circle. I drew the line. I labeled the endpoint and set the pen down and looked at what I had built across 2 pages of the legal pad. On one side, an estate account, 16 forged withdrawals, $74,000. A niece who had been in my house more times than I could count. On the other, a real estate company with a labyrinthine subsidiary structure, a CEO who had me escorted from his own gala, a financial irregularity in the charitable foundation documents that I had been contracted to review and had not yet finished reviewing. In the middle, one name, one thread, one assumption that had been made by everyone involved, Garrett Holloway, Royce Ingram, and possibly Simone, that the woman they were dealing with was not looking at both sides of the page simultaneously. It was 6:58 in the morning. I picked up the phone. I found the number I had not called in 4 years. I called it. Diana Cole picked up on the third ring. She said, "Loretta Chambers." "I wondered when you'd call." I said, "I have something." She said, "What kind?" I looked at the legal pad. 2 circles, 1 line, 3 words in the middle. Pinnacle Wealth Management. I said, "The kind where someone built a structure, assuming I would only ever be looking at one side of it." Diana was quiet for 2 seconds. Then, "Are you in Atlanta?" I said I was. She said, "Friday morning, 9 o'clock. Bring the full file. Both sides." I said I would. I hung up. I picked up my coffee, which had been cold for an hour and a half. I drank it anyway, standing at the desk, looking at the legal pad. Outside the window, Atlanta was deciding to be mourning the particular gray that precedes the light. The sound of the first few cars on the street beginning the day's accumulation. I had been awake since 4:30. I had 4 more hours of work before anything else needed my attention. I sat back down. I opened the estate file. I went back to the beginning. I had been on both sides of that table for most of my professional life. The IRS Criminal Investigation Field Office on Peachtree Street has a conference room on the 3rd floor where I once sat across from a tax attorney for 6 hours while his client's financial records stacked up between them, like evidence of exactly what they were. I have also sat on the other side of that table, the agent's side, the side where the documentation is already organized before anyone walks in more times than I could number. I know the room's dimensions. I know the way the afternoon light comes through the window at an angle that always makes whoever is facing it squint slightly, which is not accidental and which experienced agents account for when they seat their counterparts. On Friday morning at 9 o'clock, Diana Cole sat on the agent's side. I sat across from her. I placed the file on the table between us. This is what it is to walk back into a professional world you left. The room is the same, and you are different, and the difference sits in your body in a specific way that does not resolve into either comfort or discomfort. It is simply a fact of the space. I had retired. I had given back my credentials. I had cleaned my desk, said the goodbyes that are said, driven home in the particular silence of someone who has finished something that lasted 26 years. I am a private citizen now, running a consulting firm from a 2nd bedroom. None of that changed what I knew. None of it changed what I had built. Diana listened for 40 minutes. She is a woman who has not changed since the first day I met her 22 years ago, in the way that certain people do not change, not because they have remained static, but because who they are was formed early and has only become more itself over time. She asked 2 questions during my entire presentation. She wrote both answers down. When I finished, she looked at the file for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "You know you're not an agent anymore." "I know exactly what I am," I said. "I am a private citizen with legal standing as an estate executor. I am a compliance consultant with a current contractual relationship to the entity under review. Every document I am presenting was obtained in one of those 2 capacities. Every piece of this is clean." She held my gaze for 3 seconds. Then she picked up the file. Give me until Monday. I'll have my team pull parallel records on the estate accounts and the Meridian subsidiaries. While you do that, I said, I'm going to continue the compliance work. She looked up from the file. Loretta, I have a contract and 6 unanswered compliance questions. I'm going to do my job. She set the file down. She did something I had rarely seen Diana do in 22 years of working with her. She smiled. Not warmly, exactly. The smile of one professional acknowledging another. Monday, she said. I'll call you. What Diana's team found over the following 2 weeks was what I had suspected and had not yet been able to prove because my access was limited to the Meridian documents and the estate account, 2 data points from a pattern that turned out to be much larger. When they pulled records on Pinnacle Wealth Management's estate management accounts and cross-referenced them with the IRS database of estate executor filings in the Atlanta metro area, the picture that emerged was not complicated. It was just large. 11 accounts over 6 years. Unauthorized withdrawals from all 11. 9 of the 11 executors were black women. 8 of those 9 were widows. The withdrawals per account ranged from $51,000 to $89,000, with my account in the middle of the range. The spacing, not too frequent, not too rare, was identical across all 11 cases, which meant it had not emerged organically from the individual dynamics of each account. It had been applied. Someone had looked at the aggregate results of the first 2 or 3 accounts, identified the optimal spacing to avoid detection, and standardized it. That is not desperation. That is system design. The average age of the executors was 63. The average estate value was $1.4 million, large enough to contain $70,000 in withdrawals that could be attributed to fees and portfolio management expenses, not large enough to employ the kind of professional oversight that would catch the discrepancy quickly. The accounts were in Pinnacle because someone had recommended Pinnacle to someone in each case, a financial advisor, a real estate attorney, a banker who was in turn connected to Royce Ingram's network through a referral structure that Ingram had built over 6 years and which appeared, on its surface, to be ordinary professional networking. The targeting was not accidental. The criteria had been written somewhere by someone. Diana's team was going to find them. In the meantime, I went to my Thursday meeting at Meridian Group. I want to be precise about what it is to conduct professional work in an organization while simultaneously building the evidentiary foundation for a federal investigation of that organization, because it is not as dramatic as it sounds and the lack of drama is important. The work of a compliance consultant does not change because the context around it has changed. You review the documents you are contracted to review. You ask the questions that are in scope. You document every interaction with the specificity that professional standards require. You do not improvise. You do not overreach. You do exactly what you are hired to do. And you do it carefully, because every interaction you have will be part of a record, and the record has to be unimpeachable. Garrett continued to manage me the way he had managed me from the beginning, as a service provider who should not require significant engagement from the principal. In meetings, he spoke across me rather than to me. He referenced the compliance review in terms that suggested it was a bureaucratic inconvenience rather than a professional process with legal weight. He introduced me, on one occasion, to a board member who had not previously met me by gesturing in my general direction and saying, "And this is our compliance person. Not my name, not my firm, not the title I hold, or the scope of what I had been hired to assess." I said, "Loretta Chambers, Chambers Advisory Group." He had already moved to the next item on his agenda. I wrote it down. The date, the time, the attendees, the exact words. I had been writing things down like this since the first week of my employment there. I would continue writing them down for as long as the contract required. The FBI field office entered the investigation 3 weeks after my meeting with Diana. Because the fraud crossed state lines, Pinnacle held registrations in Georgia, Nevada, and Delaware, and the wire transfers moved money through accounts in all 3 which elevated the jurisdiction and brought in a different set of tools. The agent assigned to the financial crimes component was Special Agent Renee Okafor, 34, out of the Atlanta field office, with a background in estate fraud that told me the assignment had been deliberate. The Bureau does not waste expertise. We met twice before the formal investigation structure was established. Both times, she asked questions that told me exactly how good she was. Not because they were dramatic or comprehensive, but because they were precise. She asked about the specific characteristics of the forged signatures. She asked which transaction I had flagged first, and what in it caught my attention before I consciously understood why. She asked whether I had noticed any change in Pinnacle's communication patterns with the estate account after the date of my last estate review, which was a question I had not thought to ask, and which I then went back and checked and found mattered. At the end of our second meeting, she asked how I had identified the fraud. I told her about the loop, the specific characteristic of my signature that had been almost correctly reproduced but not quite. She said, "How long have you been signing your name the same way?" I said, 47 years. I learned it from my 7th grade English teacher. She said, "Your signature is the one thing that should always be unmistakably yours." Renee said, "The forgery was good." "Yes," I said, "not good enough." She wrote something down. I did not ask what. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered to my home address. Meridian Group's legal letterhead heavy paper, the kind that signals that the firm's identity was considered when the stationery was ordered. Strategic realignment in the second paragraph. Effective immediately in the third. 14 days to submit my final invoice. I read the letter twice. I set it on the desk beside the legal pad. Then I called Diana. She answered on the second ring. I said, "Meridian just terminated my contract." "How?" Certified letter. Strategic realignment. Effective immediately. She said, "When did it arrive?" "This morning." A pause. "That means they know something has shifted." "Did you get everything you needed from their documents before this?" I looked at my desk. The Meridian compliance files, 6 weeks of them. The subsidiary map on the legal pad. The 6 compliance questions, and the 12 answers, and the 6 non-answers that were themselves answers of a different kind. The footnote on page 31. The officer registry on page 18. The documentation of every meeting, every dismissal, every introduction that used compliance person instead of my name. I said, "I got everything I needed the first week. Everything after that was confirmation." Diana said, "Then we're close, Reddy." I said, "We're close." After we hung up, I sat at my desk and looked at the letter. Strategic realignment. I have read a great many documents in my life, and I have developed over time the ability to hear the thing underneath the language. The decision that was made before the language was chosen to express it. The decision underneath strategic realignment was, we know she has been looking at us. We are removing her access before she finds anything else. What they did not know, because they had not thought to ask what she might already have, was that the access I needed had been completed before they thought to revoke it. The letter was not a termination. It was a confirmation. An organization that had nothing to hide does not send certified letters. It does not deploy its legal department against a compliance consultant's contract. It does not act with the speed of an organization that has realized it has made a mistake and is trying to contain the radius. The radius was already larger than they knew. I had made sure of that in the first week, before they understood what they were dealing with. I folded the letter. I placed it in the file beside the legal pad. One more document. One more piece of a record that was now in the hands of the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and would shortly be in the hands of the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Georgia. I opened my laptop. I opened the expert witness statement I had begun 3 days ago. I read the last paragraph I had written. I placed my hands on the keyboard. I continued. I had been on both sides of that table for most of my professional life. The IRS Criminal Investigation Field Office on Peachtree Street has a conference room on the third floor, where I once sat across from a tax attorney for 6 hours, while his client's financial records stacked up between them, like evidence of exactly what they were. I have also sat on the other side of that table, the agent side, the side where the documentation is already organized before anyone walks in more times than I could number. I know the room's dimensions. I know the way the afternoon light comes through the window, at an angle that always makes whoever is facing it squint slightly, which is not accidental, and which experienced agents account for when they seat their counterparts. On Friday morning at 9 o'clock, Diana Cole sat on the agent's side. I sat across from her. I placed the file on the table between us. This is what it is to walk back into a professional world you left. The room is the same, and you are different, and the difference sits in your body in a specific way that does not resolve into either comfort or discomfort. It is simply a fact of the space. I had retired. I had given back my credentials. I had cleaned my desk, said the goodbyes that are said, driven home in the particular silence of someone who has finished something that lasted 26 years. I am a private citizen now, running a consulting firm from a second bedroom. None of that changed what I knew. None of it changed what I had built. Diana listened for 40 minutes. She is a woman who has not changed since the first day I met her, 22 years ago. In the way that certain people do not change not because they have remained static, but because who they are was formed early and has only become more itself over time. She asked 2 questions during my entire presentation. She wrote both answers down. When I finished, she looked at the file for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "You know you're not an agent anymore." "I know exactly what I am," I said. "I am a private citizen with legal standing as an estate executor. I am a compliance consultant with a current contractual relationship to the entity under review. Every document I am presenting was obtained in one of those 2 capacities. Every piece of this is clean." She held my gaze for 3 seconds. Then she picked up the file. "Give me until Monday. I'll have my team pull parallel records on the estate accounts and the Meridian subsidiaries. While you do that," I said, "I'm going to continue the compliance work." She looked up from the file. "Loretta, I have a contract and 6 unanswered compliance questions. I'm going to do my job." She set the file down. She did something I had rarely seen Diana do in 22 years of working with her. She smiled. Not warmly, exactly. The smile of one professional acknowledging another. "Monday," she said. "I'll call you." What Diana's team found over the following 2 weeks was what I had suspected and had not yet been able to prove. Because my access was limited to the Meridian documents and the estate account 2 data points from a pattern that turned out to be much larger. When they pulled records on Pinnacle Wealth Management's estate management accounts and cross-referenced them with the IRS database of estate executor filings in the Atlanta metro area, the picture that emerged was not complicated. It was just large. 11 accounts over 6 years. Unauthorized withdrawals from all 11. 9 of the 11 executors were Black women. 8 of those 9 were widows. The withdrawals per account ranged from $51,000 to $89,000, with my account in the middle of the range. The spacing, not too frequent, not too rare, was identical across all 11 cases, which meant it had not emerged organically from the individual dynamics of each account. It had been applied. Someone had looked at the aggregate results of the first 2 or 3 accounts, identified the optimal spacing to avoid detection, and standardized it. That is not desperation. That is system design. The average age of the executors was 63. The average estate value was $1.4 million, large enough to contain $70,000 in withdrawals that could be attributed to fees and portfolio management expenses, not large enough to employ the kind of professional oversight that would catch the discrepancy quickly. The accounts were in Pinnacle because someone had recommended Pinnacle to someone in each case, a financial advisor, a real estate attorney, a banker who was in turn connected to Royce Ingram's network through a referral structure that Ingram had built over 6 years, and which appeared on its surface to be ordinary professional networking. The targeting was not accidental. The criteria had been written somewhere by someone. Diana's team was going to find them. In the meantime, I went to my Thursday meeting at Meridian Group. I want to be precise about what it is to conduct professional work in an organization, while simultaneously building the evidentiary foundation for a federal investigation of that organization, because it is not as dramatic as it sounds, and the lack of drama is important. The work of a compliance consultant does not change because the context around it has changed. You review the documents you are contracted to review. You ask the questions that are in scope. You document every interaction with the specificity that professional standards require. You do not improvise. You do not overreach. You do exactly what you were hired to do, and you do it carefully because every interaction you have will be part of a record, and the record has to be unimpeachable. Garrett continued to manage me the way he had managed me from the beginning as a service provider who should not require significant engagement from the principal. In meetings, he spoke across me rather than to me. He referenced the compliance review in terms that suggested it was a bureaucratic inconvenience rather than a professional process with legal weight. He introduced me, on one occasion, to a board member who had not previously met me by gesturing in my general direction and saying, "And this is our compliance person. Not my name, not my firm, not the title I hold, or the scope of what I had been hired to assess." I said, "Loretta Chambers, Chambers Advisory Group." He had already moved to the next item on his agenda. I wrote it down. The date, the time, the attendees, the exact words. I had been writing things down like this since the first week of my employment there. I would continue writing them down for as long as the contract required. The FBI field office entered the investigation 3 weeks after my meeting with Diana. Because the fraud crossed state lines, Pinnacle held registrations in Georgia, Nevada, and Delaware, and the wire transfers moved money through accounts in all three, which elevated the jurisdiction and brought in a different set of tools. The agent assigned to the financial crimes component was Special Agent Renee Okafor, 34, out of the Atlanta field office, with a background in estate fraud that told me the assignment had been deliberate. The Bureau does not waste expertise. We met twice before the formal investigation structure was established. Both times, she asked questions that told me exactly how good she was, not because they were dramatic or comprehensive, but because they were precise. She asked about the specific characteristics of the forged signatures. She asked which transaction I had flagged first, and what in it caught my attention before I consciously understood why. She asked whether I had noticed any change in Pinnacle's communication patterns with the estate account after the date of my last estate review, which was a question I had not thought to ask, and which I then went back and checked and found mattered. At the end of our second meeting, she asked how I had identified the fraud. I told her about the loop, the specific characteristic of my signature that had been almost correctly reproduced but not quite. She said, "How long have you been signing your name the same way?" I said, 7 years. I learned it from my 7th grade English teacher. She said, "Your signature is the one thing that should always be unmistakably yours." Renee said, "The forgery was good." "Yes," I said. "Not good enough." She wrote something down. I did not ask what. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered to my home address. Meridian Group's legal letterhead, heavy paper, the kind that signals that the firm's identity was considered when the stationery was ordered. Strategic realignment, in the second paragraph. Effective immediately in the third. 14 days to submit my final invoice. I read the letter twice. I set it on the desk beside the legal pad. Then I called Diana. She answered on the second ring. I said, "Meridian just terminated my contract." "How?" Certified letter. Strategic realignment. Effective immediately. She said, "When did it arrive?" "This morning." A pause. That means they know something has shifted. "Did you get everything you needed from their documents before this?" I looked at my desk. The Meridian compliance files, 6 weeks of them. The subsidiary map on the legal pad. The 6 compliance questions, and the 12 answers, and the 6 non-answers that were themselves answers of a different kind. The footnote on page 31, the officer registry on page 18, the documentation of every meeting, every dismissal, every introduction that used compliance person instead of my name. I said, "I got everything I needed the first week. Everything after that was confirmation." Diana said, "Then we're close, Reddy." I said, "We're close." After we hung up, I sat at my desk and looked at the letter. Strategic realignment. I have read a great many documents in my life, and I have developed, over time, the ability to hear the thing underneath the language. The decision that was made before the language was chosen to express it. The decision underneath strategic realignment was, we know she has been looking at us. We are removing her access before she finds anything else. What they did not know, because they had not thought to ask what she might already have, was that the access I needed had been completed before they thought to revoke it. The letter was not a termination. It was a confirmation. An organization that had nothing to hide does not send certified letters. It does not deploy its legal department against a compliance consultant's contract. It does not act with the speed of an organization that has realized it has made a mistake and is trying to contain the radius. The radius was already larger than they knew. I had made sure of that in the first week, before they understood what they were dealing with. I folded the letter. I placed it in the file beside the legal pad. One more document. One more piece of a record that was now in the hands of the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and would shortly be in the hands of the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Georgia. I opened my laptop. I opened the expert witness statement I had begun 3 days ago. I read the last paragraph I had written. I placed my hands on the keyboard. I continued. The hardest thing about handing a case to investigators is that the case stops being yours. Not formally, your name stays on the documentation. Your testimony will matter. Your methodology will be scrutinized and defended and, eventually, validated. But the motion of it, the daily forward progress, the sense of direct connection between your actions and its development that transfers. You become a resource rather than a driver. You wait. You respond to calls rather than making them. You read news alerts rather than building the narrative that will become them. I have handed cases off before. I know the discipline of it. The discipline does not make the waiting comfortable. It makes it manageable. On the second Tuesday after Meridian terminated my contract, a man named Franklin Osei called at 10 in the morning. He identified himself as a criminal defense attorney in private practice. He said he was calling on behalf of Simone Chambers' ward. He said Simone had retained him. He said Simone wished to communicate, through counsel, that she was prepared to cooperate fully with any federal investigation and wanted to understand the parameters of that cooperation before speaking with investigators directly. He then said something I had not expected. "She wanted me to reach out to you specifically," she said, "and I'm conveying this directly." She said, "You are the only person whose understanding of the situation she trusts to be complete." I let that sit for a moment. I thought about the Sunday afternoon and the manila folder on the kitchen table and the way Simone's eyes had moved to it before I had opened it. I thought about the 47 forged signatures and the 74 her own apartment. I said, "Mr. Osei, the parameters of Simone's cooperation are a conversation for the federal investigators and the U.S. Attorney's Office, not for me. I'm an estate executor and a former compliance consultant. I'm not in a position to speak to what her cooperation will or won't yield." "She understands that," he said. "She asked whether you would be willing, at any point in the process, to speak to her circumstances, her history, her character." If it came to that, I said, I'm willing to tell the truth about what I found and how I found it. What the investigators and the court do with that truth is not mine to direct. A pause. She anticipated you would say that, he said. She asked me to tell you that she understands. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen desk and thought about the word understands. What Simone understood at this point was the specific mathematics of her own situation. She had cooperated with investigators. She had provided testimony about Royce Ingram's methodology, and now she was in the process of learning what that cooperation was worth. She was not, at this stage, asking me to absorb the consequence. She was asking whether I would witness her accurately. There is a difference. The difference matters. I had not yet decided what to do with it. Garrett's countermove came 11 days after the contract termination, through a channel I had not anticipated and which told me something about how he operated. Not through his legal team. I had been expecting correspondence from his legal team and was prepared for it. Through the president of the Atlanta Chamber of Commerce, where I served on a business ethics advisory panel. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. The president's voice had the careful quality of someone who has been asked to make a call he did not personally want to make. He said a complaint had been filed by a senior executive at Meridian Group. The complaint alleged that I had, during my consulting engagement, accessed documents outside the scope of my contract and conducted myself in a manner that was he read from something adversarial and disruptive to organizational operations. He said he needed my response. I asked him to send me the written complaint. He said he would have his assistant transmit it. I thanked him. I hung up. I went to my desk. I opened the compliance contract I had signed with Meridian 6 weeks ago. I opened the document access log I had been maintaining since my first week, every file I had requested, the contractual basis for the request, the date and time, and the name of the person who provided access. I had been keeping this log not because I anticipated it being necessary, but because I keep it on every engagement. 26 years. Old habit. In this instance, extraordinarily useful. The written complaint arrived 2 hours later. I read it carefully. Then I wrote a 2-page response in the measured, specific language of professional self-defense, the kind of writing that makes no emotional argument, that cites only what is documented, that has no rhetorical excess, because excess gives the other party something to argue with. I attached to it 14 pages of documentation, the contract language, the access log, the dated meeting notes, the written compliance questions I had submitted, and the responses I had received and the 6 that had not been answered. I delivered it to the chamber president's office by hand at 3:15 in the afternoon. I also sent it by certified mail simultaneously, so there would be 2 timestamps on its receipt. Both the physical delivery and the postal record would exist in perpetuity. This is not paranoia. This is practice. I did not hear from the chamber president again. Simone asked to meet in a coffee shop near the federal building on a Thursday morning neutral ground. Her request, which I respected because it was the kind of request that tells you where someone is emotionally. She did not want to come to the house. I understood that. I met her at 8:30. She was already there when I arrived, which I noted, because Simone has historically been 10 minutes late to most things, and punctuality in a person who is usually late signals a different kind of attention to the stakes. She looked thinner. Not dramatically, just the kind of thinning that happens when someone has been spending energy on worry rather than on meals. She had ordered coffee and not touched it, which I noticed because I have a long-time relationship with untouched coffee and recognize it when I see it. She said, I cooperated. I gave them everything I knew about Royce, the account selection process, the transfer structure, the communication protocols he used. They told me it was meaningful to the case. I said, that was the right decision. She looked at her cup. My attorney says the cooperation factor will matter at sentencing. If it goes to sentencing, a pause. Will it go to sentencing? That's a question for your attorney and the U.S. Attorney's Office, I said. She nodded. She knew I was going to say that. She said, are you going to come? If there is one? I looked at her across the coffee shop table. This is a different table than my kitchen table, a different chair than the one she has been sitting in at Sunday dinners, a different version of this conversation than the one we have been having in one form or another since she was a teenager. And I was the person in her life who did not let things go without naming them. I thought about 14 in one suitcase. I thought about the college fund, and Eli, and the forged L, and what James would have thought about all of it. I thought about what it costs to love someone across 24 years, and what it costs when that love becomes a door they walk through in the wrong direction. I said, I don't know yet. It was the most honest answer I had, and it was the only one I was going to give. She nodded. She understood that too. She picked up her coffee and looked at it and set it back down. We talked for another 20 minutes about nothing related to the case, her apartment, a book she had been reading, whether I had spoken to Marcus recently. The kind of conversation two people have when they are trying to locate the pieces of a relationship that existed before the damage. I do not know yet what those pieces will amount to, but I did not leave early. I let the conversation run its natural length. Diana called on a Wednesday evening at 7:15. I was in the kitchen. I had made dinner rice, the last of the collard greens I had cooked Sunday, the kind of simple meal that requires enough attention to keep your hands occupied without requiring so much that it interferes with thought. James used to say I did my best thinking when I was moving, and he was right, and cooking is a form of moving that keeps the hands in one place. She said, tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, both of them. I set the spoon down. Both. Garrett Holloway, 17 counts. Royce Ingram, 11 counts. Federal wire fraud, conspiracy, financial exploitation of a protected class. I said, what is the protected class designation built on? 9 of 11 victims were black women over 55 who were managing estates as widows. The pattern is too consistent, too uniform, and too specifically targeted to characterize as coincidence. The U.S. attorney signed off on the protected class enhancement last week. Renee's team had it documented from the targeting criteria they pulled from Ingram's internal communications. I stood very still in my kitchen. They found the written criteria, Garrett's email. To Ingram, dated 3 years ago. The language. Diana paused. The language is specific. I'll let you read it when it's in discovery. You built this, Reddy. We'd have gotten there eventually. Would have taken us 2, maybe 3 years without what you brought in. I said, thank you for calling me directly. You earned the call, she said, and hung up. I finished making dinner. I ate at the kitchen table, which is what I do when I am processing something. I do not skip meals. I do not sit in the dark, staring at the wall. I eat because the body requires it and because routine is its own kind of discipline. James used to tease me about this. Rhett, he would say, your brain doesn't punch out even when the rest of you does. He said it as a compliment. I never told him how often I wished it weren't true. I washed the dish. I dried it. I put it back in the cabinet in the exact spot it came from. Because I keep my kitchen the way I keep my documentation. Everything in its place, and the place known without looking. My phone buzzed on the counter, a news alert. I picked it up. Meridian Group CEO Garrett Holloway, arrested on federal fraud charges, Atlanta, GA. I read the article through once. At the bottom, 3 paragraphs from the end. 1 sentence. The investigation was initiated following documentation provided by Atlanta-based compliance consultant Loretta Chambers of Chambers Advisory Group, whose referral to federal investigators last November launched the 14-month inquiry. My phone began to ring. Numbers I did not recognize. I watched the screen cycle through calls. I had no intention of answering. Then one number I did recognize appeared, Garrett Holloway's personal cell, which I had retained from the Meridian contact directory since the start of my engagement. It rang twice, then stopped. I set the phone face down on the counter. I went to my desk. I opened the expert witness statement, 12 pages, double-spaced, each paragraph sourced and numbered. I found the place where I had stopped on Tuesday. I read the last sentence. I placed my hands on the keyboard, the same hands that had been reading financial documents since before Garrett Holloway had his first accounting course, and I kept going. Knowing something and proving it are two different acts that require two different kinds of discipline. Knowing is mostly intuition confirmed by evidence. It is the moment when the pieces arrange themselves into a picture you can see before you can articulate why you are seeing it. I have been knowing things about financial crimes since the early years of my career, and the knowing arrives quickly when the pattern is there, a feeling in the chest, a particular sharpening of attention, the mind running ahead of the eyes, and finding something that should not be there. Proving is the opposite of intuitive. Proving is the slow, methodical work of building what you know into a structure that holds under the weight of a cross-examination by someone whose entire job is to find the places where it does not hold. It is every fact sourced, every conclusion traceable to the evidence that supports it, every gap acknowledged before the opposing counsel finds it. Because gaps you acknowledge yourself are weaknesses you control, and gaps they find are weaknesses they own. I worked on the expert witness statement for 6 days. Not continuously. I slept, I ate, I ran. The 2 miles around the neighborhood every morning that I have run since my knees allowed it. I did the ordinary maintenance of a life. But the statement was the first thing I opened in the morning and the last thing I closed at night, and in the hours between, I did not let my attention drift from it for long. At the end of 6 days, it was 17 pages, every fact cited, every conclusion documented. I read it twice with the specific attention of a person looking for the places that would not hold, found 3, revised them, and read it once more. Then I sent it to Renee Okafor and to the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I closed the document. The preparation was done. What came next was not mine to build. In the days that followed, I had a different kind of work to do. Not the documented kind, the interior kind, which does not have a filing system and does not resolve neatly, and which I have never been as good at as the other. I have been asked, in the month since, whether I was angry with Simone. The honest answer is that anger is not the primary thing I felt, and is not the thing I am still carrying. Anger is usually about surprise, the rupture between what you believed and what turned out to be true. I am 61 years old, and I have spent my career in rooms where people do terrible things to each other for reasons that always make sense to the person doing them. I have not been surprised by human capacity for self-interest in a long time. What I felt about Simone, what I am still feeling, in the complicated way of things that have no clean resolution, is grief. The specific grief of understanding that you can give a person every tool you know how to give, can spend 24 years providing resources and stability, and the kind of love that shows up in practical form rather than just in feeling, and still not reach whatever it is in them that decides. The failure of influence is not the same as failure of effort. I know this. Knowing it does not make it easier to hold. I called Marcus on a Tuesday evening, not to tell him the full scope of it, not yet, not until the legal process had moved further along, and the story I was telling him could include its resolution rather than just its middle. I called because I needed to hear my son's voice, and because needing that is not a weakness I have any intention of managing away. He answered on the second ring. He said, "Mom, what's going on?" He has always been able to hear something in my voice that I do not intend to broadcast, and he has always responded to it by asking directly, rather than waiting to be invited. He got that from James, who also asked directly, who believed that the kindest thing you can do for someone carrying weight is to ask them what it is, rather than pretending not to notice. I said, "I'm working through something. He said, "What does working through something mean in Loretta Chambers' language?" I said, "It means I'm managing it. Do you need me to come?" I looked at the kitchen, the same surfaces I have looked at every day for 15 years. The photograph on the counter that catches the light in the late afternoon. "No," I said. "Tell Eli I love him." "Tell him yourself," Marcus said. "He's right here." There was a brief shuffling sound, and then my grandson's voice, 13 years old and already longer in vowel sounds than his father was at that age, with the particular enthusiasm of a person who has recently encountered something that has genuinely captured his attention. He had a history project. He was doing a presentation about the civil rights movement in Atlanta, specifically about the economic dimensions of it, the way financial exclusion and legal exclusion operated together, the way targeting someone's economic standing was also a way of targeting their freedom. He wanted to know if I knew anything about that. He had heard I worked in finance. I talked to him for 9 minutes. Not because the conversation was easy, but because it was the right conversation to be having at that moment, with that person, for reasons that had nothing to do with the case and everything to do with why the case mattered. James built that college fund for this boy. He believed in exactly the kind of mind that asks questions like this one, that is already, at 13, putting together the connection between the economic and the political and the legal in ways that most people do not begin to see until much later, if they see them at all. Eli does not know about the fund. I have not told him that there was ever a problem with it. I will not tell him until it has been made whole, which the restitution order will accomplish, and which it has not yet accomplished because the case has not yet gone to verdict. He will learn what his grandfather left him, and he will learn that it was protected, and he will not need to know the cost of that protection. That is a choice I am making for him, and it is the right one. Royce Ingram took a cooperation deal. His attorney arranged it 3 weeks before trial, 11 federal counts. Cooperation in exchange for sentencing consideration. What he gave the prosecution in exchange was more complete than even Diana had anticipated. Not just testimony about the account targeting process, but documentation, Garrett's own internal emails. A chain of 13 messages spanning 14 months in which Garrett had communicated to Ingram in the flat, corporate language of someone who does not see why what he is directing should require euphemism. The criteria for account selection, the spacing protocols for withdrawals, and the performance expectations for the program. The language of one email, which I read in discovery and which I will not reproduce, but which I have not forgotten, described the target demographic with the specific precision of a man who has been thinking about this strategically for long enough that he no longer feels the need to be careful. He had named the characteristics. He had named the assumption that these women would not notice, would not investigate, would not have the resources or the professional standing to do anything effective if they did. He was wrong about me. He had dismissed me before understanding what I was. Garrett's defense team filed a motion to exclude my documentation from evidence. The argument was that I had exceeded my consulting scope, that my access to Meridian documents had been improper, and that the initial referral was therefore tainted. It was a long shot, and everyone involved knew it was a long shot, but it was what they had. The motion required me to submit to a deposition about my methodology. I sat across from Garrett's attorney for 4 hours and 20 minutes. I was precise. I was calm. I produced, for every document referenced, the contractual basis for my access to it and the dated log entry confirming when and how it had been obtained. The motion was denied. The pretrial hearing was on a Thursday morning. I was present as a consulting expert to the prosecution, seated behind the table rather than at it. The courtroom had the specific quality of early-stage legal proceedings not yet charged with the weight of a trial, but already past the point of ordinary civic function. Attorneys moving documents, a clerk arranging materials, the low conversation of people doing work. Garrett entered from the side. He was in a dark suit, not the specific charcoal of the Gala, something slightly lighter. The choice of a man who has been advised on courtroom optics and has complied. He moved differently than he moved in that ballroom. Not worse. Exactly. Smaller. The particular compression that happens when a man who has spent his career in rooms where he set the terms walks into one where he does not. He scanned the room the way people scan rooms when they are looking for the distribution of threat. His eyes moved across the gallery, across the bench where the judge would shortly sit, across the prosecution's table, across my face, and stopped. I watched him process it. The recognition happening in stages, each one visible. The compliance consultant from the conference room. The woman in the lobby of the Peachtree Hotel, sitting in the chair while the gala played behind the closed door. The expert whose documentation had initiated the federal referral. The same person, all three of them, in one chair, behind the prosecution's table, looking at him. He held my gaze for 3 seconds. I did not look away. I did not adjust my expression. I simply looked back with the same steady, unremarkable attention I bring to every document that requires my full consideration. He looked away first. 19 days before the trial date, a letter arrived at the house. Not email, a handwritten envelope, addressed in Simone's handwriting, postmarked from a return address I did not recognize. I held it for a full day before I opened it. Not because I was afraid of what it contained, because I understood that whatever it contained would require something from me that I needed to be ready to give. I opened it, standing at the kitchen counter, which is where I handle correspondence that matters. 3 pages, handwritten, in the careful script Simone uses when she wants something to count. She did not begin with an apology, she said, that she knew she had not yet earned the right to offer one. She said she wanted me to know what she understood she had taken. Not the money, though she named the amount, the fund, the purpose of it, the person it was meant for. She wrote about James. She wrote about what it meant to have grown up with a man like him as the gravitational center of a household, and what it meant that she had taken from his memory. On the last page, set apart from everything else by a full line of space above it, one sentence. You are the most honest person I have ever known, and I wish I had spent more of my life being afraid of disappointing you instead of being afraid of everything else. I read it twice. I folded it along its original creases. I stood at the counter for a moment, looking at James's photograph, the mid-laugh one, head back, completely unguarded. Then I walked to the kitchen desk and opened the bottom drawer, where I keep the things that require more from me than I am currently able to give. And I placed the letter inside it, and I closed the drawer. I had a trial to prepare for. I went back to work. The oath is the same every time. Do you swear to tell the truth? The whole truth? And nothing but the truth? I have heard it administered to hundreds of witnesses in my career. I have observed the way people receive it, some with solemnity, some with what reads as impatience to get past the formality and into the substance, some with the specific discomfort of a person who is already calculating how much truth is going to be required of them. I have always paid attention to how a witness takes the oath because it tells you something about how they understand the room they are in and what they believe the room can do to them. When my turn came, on the morning of the 3rd day of trial, I raised my right hand and I said I do with the same weight I have given every meaningful commitment of my life. Not performatively, not for the gallery, because I meant it, and because I have spent 26 years in service to the idea that the truth is the only thing the law has to work with. And when you take that oath, you are making a promise to the process itself, not to the judge, not to the jury, not to the attorneys on either side of the room, but to the process that has no allegiance to anyone's convenience and does not soften what it finds. Then I sat down. The federal courtroom for the Northern District of Georgia has the specific gravity of rooms where decisions are made that cannot be unmade. High ceilings, wood paneling, the flag behind the bench, the gallery already full at 8:50 in the morning, media in every row, several faces I recognized from Atlanta's legal and business communities, 2 of the other 10 victims who had been notified of the trial date and had chosen to attend. I had been in rooms like this in every city I had ever worked in. I have never found them intimidating. I have always found them clarifying. This is where the documentation arrives at its destination. This is where the work either holds or it doesn't. It held. The U.S. attorney, a woman named Andrea Lim, who I had spent 3 hours with in pretrial preparation, and who understood financial crimes with the specific fluency of someone who had built her career on them, walked me through the documentation methodically and without excess. She was doing what good attorneys do with expert witnesses, staying out of the way. She asked the questions that let me explain what I had found and how I had found it, and then she let me explain it. I was precise. I was not detached. There is a difference between detachment and precision, and juries understand the difference. They understand when someone is deliberately removing themselves from what they are presenting because they are afraid of it, and they understand when someone is being precise because precision is what the material requires. I was precise about the loop. I was precise about the access log. I was precise about the forensic accounting methodology I had applied to the Meridian subsidiary structure and the specific characteristics of the targeting pattern across all 11 accounts. When Andrea asked me to characterize Garrett Holloway's strategy, I said, the selection criteria were not random. They were designed. The accounts were chosen because the people managing them were assumed to be unlikely to investigate, unlikely to understand what they were looking at, and unlikely to be believed if they did. The design of the program depended on that assumption, holding across every case simultaneously. The assumption was wrong in mine. The rest of the program was exposed as a consequence. The defense cross-examination began after the lunch recess. Garrett's attorney was a man named Philip Wentworth, competent, experienced, with the controlled aggression of a litigator who understands that his job in this cross-examination is not to disprove what I had said, but to create enough uncertainty in a juror's mind that reasonable doubt has somewhere to live. He asked about my methodology. He asked about the contractual scope of my access. He asked whether I had ever operated outside the boundaries of my engagement in ways that weren't documented. I answered every question with the documentation that answered it. He moved on. Then he asked, Miss Chambers, do you believe that Mr. Holloway had you removed from the November Gala because he was aware of who you were and what you were investigating? The room was attentive in the way of rooms that are anticipating something. I said, no. He paused. This was not the answer he had prepared for. No? No, I said. I don't believe Mr. Holloway had me removed because he knew who I was. I believe he had me removed because he looked at me and decided I was someone who did not matter. That is a different thing entirely. I held the pause for one beat. And it is the thing that cost him everything. The gallery stirred. Not loudly, the controlled murmur of 300 people who all had the same thought at the same moment and had to decide whether to let it be audible. Judge Desmond did not reach for her gavel. The quiet came back on its own. The way quiet comes back when something true has been said in a room that is built for it. Wentworth had no follow-up. He sat down. Garrett took the stand on the 4th day, against his attorney's advice. I had expected this. Men like Garrett Holloway do not, as a rule, accept the role of passive observer in proceedings about themselves. The witness stand offers the illusion of agency, the chance to speak directly, to correct the record, to impose his version of events on a room that has thus far been reading documents he did not write. The illusion is costly. It almost always is. He was combative from the first question. He referred to my documentation as the work of a disgruntled former contractor. He described the 11 victim accounts as standard estate wealth management activity. He said, at one point, that the protected class enhancement was a legal maneuver built on a politically motivated interpretation of ordinary business decisions. What he did not do, for 3 days of testimony, was look at the jury. He looked at his attorney, at the ceiling, at the documents his counsel placed in front of him, at the judge when addressing her. The The 12 people whose decision would determine the remainder of his life sat 8 feet to his left, and he did not turn his eyes to them once. I watched from my seat, and I thought about what I know about the relationship between eye contact and culpability. Not that people who look away are always guilty, but that people who are telling the truth in a room that frightens them will almost always, at some point, look to the people who can believe them. Garrett had no access to belief in that room. He knew it. His body showed it. Deliberations lasted 5 hours and 22 minutes. I was in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the courthouse when Diana texted. I finished my coffee. I left the amount of the check plus 20% on the table. I walked back through the midday Atlanta heat, which in October has finally released its grip, but keeps a residual warmth in the pavement, and I went back in. 14 counts. Guilty on all. Royce Ingram. 11 counts. Guilty on all. Sentencing to be reduced in consideration of his cooperation. Garrett Holloway showed nothing when the verdict was read. Not the shock of genuine surprise. Not the collapse of a man who has finally run out of options. A kind of blankness. The specific blankness of someone whose processing requires privacy, and who has enough control left to deny the room the satisfaction of watching it. I was not watching for his reaction. I was watching the gallery. The 2 victim women 2 rows behind me. Both of them had come because someone they trusted had found a way to tell them, finally, what had been done to their money and why. And they had come to see what the law did with that information. They were watching the jury. When the foreman said guilty, one of them a woman, perhaps 10 years older than me, who had told Diana's investigators that she had spent 2 years wondering if she had simply mismanaged her own account, closed her eyes. She kept them closed for perhaps 20 seconds. Then she opened them. That was the moment I needed to see. Everything else was administrative. The sentencing came 3 weeks later. Judge Patricia Desmond, 61, has been on the federal bench for 17 years and speaks the way people speak when they have decided that precision and clarity are more powerful than rhetoric. She read from a prepared statement without consulting her notes after the first paragraph, which told me she had written it until she had it in her, not just on paper. She said the exploitation of grief as a targeting mechanism, the deliberate selection of women whose attention was divided by loss and whose likelihood of detection was calibrated into the program design, constituted an aggravated harm that the court could not treat as ordinary financial fraud. She said that Garrett Holloway had built a system premised on the assumption that certain people's trust would be taken and their losses would go unaddressed, and that this assumption was itself a crime against the foundational premise of the legal system. She sentenced him to 24 years in federal prison, full restitution to all 11 victims, forfeiture of all assets traceable to the scheme. The gavel came down. I waited until the gallery began to move. Then I picked up my bag, walked out through the side corridor, and went to the parking garage. My car was on the 3rd level. I took the stairs because I always take the stairs when I need to think. And I stood beside the car with my hand on the door, and I let what had happened arrive at full weight. 4 years since James. 19 months of forged signatures. 6 weeks of compliance work inside an organization that had already decided what I was and was wrong. The legal pad with circles and lines. The footnote on page 31. The coffee that went cold every morning because the work did not wait for it. The lobby chair and the email and the security guard pretending not to watch. I gave it 3 minutes. Not as a rule, as a practice I have built over years. The understanding that feeling something fully requires time you have to deliberately give it, otherwise the feeling gets compressed into something smaller than it deserves, and surfaces later in forms you do not choose. 3 minutes. The sounds of the parking garage around me, a car starting 2 levels below, the mechanical hum of the ventilation system, Atlanta's traffic filtered through concrete. Then I opened the door. I got in. I drove. The cemetery is 22 minutes from the courthouse in mid-afternoon traffic. James's grave is in a section near the east boundary, under two oaks that were substantial when they put him there and have been growing in the 4 years since. His students placed a bench the year after he died, a simple wooden bench with a brass plaque that reads, "Principal James Chambers, you have to know where you stand." I have sat on it 100 times. I sat on it now. I told him everything, out loud, in the ordinary voice I use when I am talking to someone I trust, completely, not the professional voice, not the testimony voice, the one I use in the kitchen and in the car and in the early morning hours when the work is in front of me and I am thinking through it. I told him about the gala and the lobby and the email. I told him about the 16 withdrawals and the forged L and the 90 minutes I spent sitting with Simone across the kitchen table. I told him about Diana and Renee and the 11 women and the internal email that described their grief as a feature of their vulnerability. I told him about the verdict and the sentence and the 2 women in the gallery when the foreman spoke. When I finished, the oaks were moving slightly in a wind that had come up from the south. The afternoon light was doing what it does in Atlanta in October, going warm and sideways, making even the concrete of the cemetery pathway look like it means something. I said, "I'm not done, James. There's a new file on my desk." I stood. I smoothed my jacket, the dark blue one, the one I wear when the room I am going into requires that I look like exactly what I am. I picked up my bag. I walked back to the car. I had an 8 o'clock meeting tomorrow. I needed to be ready. Writing to a 13-year-old about something that matters requires a different honesty than the kind I practice professionally. In a legal document, completeness is the standard. Every relevant fact present and accounted for, every gap closed or acknowledged. You do not select what a court needs to know based on what the court can bear to know. You give it everything and let the process decide what to do with the weight of it. Writing to Eli required a different calculation. Not dishonesty. I am not capable of that with him, and I would not want to be. But the specific honesty of a grandmother who understands that 13 is old enough to know that the world is complicated. The art is in finding what is true and also useful, what he needs to know to understand the shape of the story without inheriting its full burden. I wrote the letter over 3 evenings, not because I could not find the words I found them. I have always found words, but because each evening I read what I had written and revised it toward something simpler. And simplicity in a letter like this is harder than complexity. It is easier to explain everything than to decide what precisely is the essential thing. What I kept. His grandfather had left him something important. That something had been in danger. It was no longer in danger. The fund was whole. He would have what James had built for him. What I left out. The 16 withdrawals. The forged signature. The name Simone does not need to carry into his memory of the people who loved him when he was small. What I added, at the end, that his grandfather believed education was the one thing that, once given, could not be recalled. That James had said this not as abstract philosophy, but as a conviction formed across 33 years of watching what happened to people who had it and what happened to people who did not. That Eli was going to have it. That this was not in question. I sealed the envelope on Thursday morning. I walked to the mailbox on the corner, which I have been walking to for 15 years, on the same route past the same 3 houses, and I put the letter in and raised the flag. Then I walked back. That was all. Some things do not require more ceremony than they already contain. Simone's sentencing was on a Wednesday in January. I have attended sentencings before, hundreds of them as an agent, as an observer, twice as a victim advocate in cases where I had ongoing relationships with the people the defendant had harmed. I know the specific mechanics of that room, the way time slows before the judge speaks, the way the defendant either faces the bench directly or angles away from it depending on whether their attorney has given them courtroom coaching, the way the gallery reads the room in the seconds between the end of the judge's statement and the gavel. I sat in the back row. I arrived after the room had filled and found a seat at the end of an aisle. I had not told anyone I was coming. The judge read the sentence. 30 months of supervised probation, 400 hours of community service, full restitution to the estate of James Chambers in the amount of $74,000, and permanent revocation of her financial advisory license. The restitution was nominal at this stage. The amount had already been made whole through the Meridian restitution order, but the legal finding mattered. It named what had been taken from whose account and by whom, and that naming had its own weight separate from the money. I watched Simone receive it. She was still in the way of someone who has been preparing for this and has come to a kind of acceptance of it that does not look like peace and is not peace, but is its functional substitute when peace is not available. Her attorney touched her arm briefly when the judge finished. She nodded. Then, as she was gathering herself to be led out, she turned. I do not know if she had known I was there. I do not know whether Franklin Osei had told her, or whether she had seen me when she came in and had simply been waiting. She turned and her eyes found mine across the width of the gallery, with the directness of someone who had thought about this moment in advance and knew where she was looking for. We held it for 3 seconds. I did not look away, and she did not look away. And in those 3 seconds, there was everything that 24 years of a relationship contains, and nothing that resolved it, and nothing that erased it. Then I nodded once, barely perceptible. The kind of nod that does not promise anything and does not withhold everything. The kind that says, I see you. I have always seen you. I do not know yet what that means going forward, but I am not looking away. She turned. She walked out. I put on my coat. I left the way I had come in. The weekend after the sentencing, Marcus brought Eli to Atlanta. I did not ask them to come. Marcus called on Thursday and said they were coming on Friday and asked if I needed anything from the grocery store. I said I did not. I cleaned the house and made up the guest room and made sure there was food for 3 and put Eli's old blanket on the bed in the room he uses, the one with the football teams on it that he is almost certainly too old for and that I keep because he has never said to get rid of it. They arrived Friday evening. Marcus, who is James's son in every way that a son inherits a parent's particular quality of presence in a room, sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and talked about his school in Memphis, a high school now. He had made the transition 2 years ago from middle and about the teachers he was managing and the budget concerns and the specific politics of a public school in a city that has complicated feelings about its own public schools. He did not ask about the case. He knew enough to understand that if I wanted to tell him more, I would tell him, and that if I was not telling him, I had a reason, and that respecting the reason was a form of care. Eli arrived at the kitchen table an hour after they did, having been in the guest room unpacking with the thoroughness of a person who believes the arrangement of their belongings in a space constitutes claiming it. He had a history project. He spread it across the part of the kitchen table that was not occupied by coffee cups, and he explained it with the intensity of genuine interest, which is different from the performance of interest and which I have always been able to distinguish, because James was the same way when he cared about something. He did not modulate his enthusiasm for an audience. He simply was enthusiastic and expected the room to keep up. The project was about the economic dimensions of the civil rights movement in Atlanta. Not the marches and the speeches, those too, but underneath them, the financial architecture, the insurance companies that would not cover Black-owned businesses, the lending institutions that would not extend credit, the way economic exclusion and legal exclusion operated as a single system with 2 faces. He had done research that was frankly impressive for a 13-year-old, and he wanted my opinion on it. We sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours on Saturday morning, going through my boxes of photographs from the 1970s, which I keep in the hall closet in the labeled containers I use for everything I intend to keep long-term. He asked questions that required me to think, not because they were complex in an academic sense, but because they were specific in a personal sense, the kind of questions that can only be answered by someone who was in those years in this city and has been carrying what she observed. When Marcus came down to collect him for lunch, Eli stood up and hugged me the way teenagers hug, briefly and with the arms going around, rather than the full contact hug of a small child, but real. He said, into my shoulder, "Grandma, you're kind of legendary." I said, "Kind of." He laughed. The laugh he has had since he was 4 years old, that starts in his chest and arrives in a sound that was James's laugh when James was happy. Then he followed his father out the door and they were gone. And I stood in the kitchen for a moment in the particular quiet that houses have after people leave them. I went to my desk. I opened the bottom drawer where I had put Simone's letter 3 months ago. I took it out. I read it again, not searching for something new, not preparing for anything. Just reading it the way you read something when you have decided it is time to know it fully, rather than to hold it at the edge of your attention. On the last page, the sentence that had put it in the drawer. "You are the most honest person I have ever known." I folded it back along its creases. I did not put it in the drawer. I put it on the desk, beside the legal pad, in the place where I keep the things I am still working out. That is the most honest thing I can say about where I am with it. I am still working it out. I may be working it out for a long time. That is not the same as not working it out, and it is not the same as having given up on the question, and it is where I am. Renee Okafor called on a Monday morning, 8:42, which is early enough to be a business call and late enough to not be an emergency. She said, "I know you're technically retired." I said, "I run a consulting firm." "Right." She said, "There was a situation. Financial irregularities at a pharmaceutical company, offshore accounts, a whistleblower complaint, a pattern in the preliminary numbers that looked familiar in a way she could not yet fully articulate." She said the forensic accounting would require someone with specific expertise in asset concealment structures, and she had been told I was the right call. I opened my calendar. "Wednesday works," I said. "Send me what you have before then." To whoever is listening to this, I am 61 years old, and I spent 26 years learning how to find what people hide in the places they are sure no one is looking. I have been dismissed, redirected, escorted from rooms, described as adversarial, and named compliance person in conference rooms where I was the most credentialed person present. I want to say something to you directly. The decision someone makes about who you are in the first 3 seconds of seeing you tells you more about them than it tells you about yourself. It tells you exactly what they are afraid of and what they believe they can afford to ignore. Pay attention to both. The people who dismiss you are handing you information. Use it. If this reached you, if you have ever carried something serious in a world that looked past you and assumed the carry wasn't real, leave a comment. Tell me where you are. Tell me your story. Or tell me just your city. Share this with someone who needs to hear that 26 years of preparation is not wasted when it does not look like what people expected preparation to look like. Subscribe, because I have more to say, and I have never run out of material, and I am not starting now. On Monday morning, I was at my desk at 7:15, with the coffee hot and the legal pad open to a fresh page, and the new case file that Renee had sent the previous night open on the screen. Clean edges. Red tab. The pharmaceutical company's name at the top of the first page, the whistleblower's summary below it, the preliminary financial figures arranged in columns that did not yet form a story. I read the first page. I turned to the second. Something in the third column caught the edge of my attention. Before I had consciously processed it, a rounding in a number that should not be rounded, a figure that landed too cleanly in a way that suggested it had been arranged rather than derived. The kind of thing that could be explained. The kind of thing that, in my experience, is usually not adequately explained. I picked up the pen. I wrote the date at the top of the legal pad. Below it, I drew a circle. I wrote one word inside it. I began to build. Quiet, precise, underestimated, unstoppable. The cycle continues. Listen to this. I am 61 years old, and I have spent 26 years in rooms where my presence meant nothing to people who mattered. I was dismissed at galas, overlooked by CEOs, and called adversarial when I asked questions nobody wanted answered, yet I never crumbled. Here is what I learned and what I want you to know. Your invisibility is strategic, not shameful. When people decide within 3 seconds who you are, they are revealing their own blindness, not your insignificance. I chose to remain quiet, not because I was powerless, but because precision requires silence. In that silence, I saw everything. Truth-telling has a cost, and it is worth paying. I sacrificed relationships, comfort, and acceptance to expose what was hidden. Some people will resent you for refusing to let them hide. This is their problem, not yours. Integrity means standing alone if necessary. The dismissed hold unexpected power. Underestimation is a gift. While people ignore you, you are building expertise, gathering information, understanding systems they believe you cannot touch. Then, when you move quietly, precisely, inevitably you cannot be stopped. Your preparation is never wasted, whether anyone acknowledges it or not. Every hour of learning, every question asked, every document analyzed becomes part of who you are. It waits. It accumulates. It becomes unstoppable. To those overlooked, your moment comes. Stay sharp, stay honest, stay ready.